Hello again, professional writers. Last week we viewed some basics about rhetorical theory, and this week we'll start looking at information related to our first assignment, the cover letter and resume. If you haven't already, you should view the assignment sheet for this project on our Blackboard site. That way you'll understand more of the rhetorical considerations for your documents. Notably, like with all our assignments this semester, we want to imagine that your job materials will fulfill a real-world rhetorical situation. That means you're responding to an actual job posting or internship, or else you're preparing your materials unsolicited for a company for which you'd like to work. In the end, you don't actually need to submit your materials, but you should create them as if you will. Doing so means that you've identified a specific audience and that you're writing to their needs and concerns. In this slideshow, we'll look at 8 sample resumes, all of which I've located online. In the process, we'll consider how writers organize their ideas and present themselves professionally. These resumes vary in quality, but they also vary in style and approach. There's no one single format in which a resume must appear. As we'll see in the examples, one tailored for a mechanic position might look way different from one tailored for a job as a graphic designer. I might be complimentary toward these resumes, but that's not to say they couldn't be done differently. Or I might be critical about one or another, but that's not to say they're wrong. Resumes are design-intensive documents, so by viewing these, we'll be thinking about visual rhetoric or how layout and design guide readers and create meaning. We can use these questions on the screen here to focus our attention on each writer's design choices. This slideshow is meant as a supplement to Chapter 9 of our textbook. I'm assuming you've already read that chapter, which discusses how resumes can be structured and what they might include. That chapter also talks about how cover letters and resumes pair together as complementary documents. Our book offers a few sample resumes on pages 145, 147, and 153. Those are useful in thinking about structure and organization, but they aren't super examples for layout and design. Our slideshow today will be concerned mainly with design. Before we begin, a quick word about new technology. Print resumes are slightly less common today now that LinkedIn and other employment websites have gained prominence. That is, you might list your education, work experience, professional affiliations, and so on using your LinkedIn profile, which will serve as what our textbook calls digital application materials. That's on page 151. I'd encourage you to reread that brief section, which can help us think about how your work on this assignment will be applicable when you begin applying to jobs once you graduate. Before we get into the sample resumes, however, we'll start this slideshow with a quick free writing exercise. If we were an in-person section of Writing in the Professions, I'd ask each of you to take out a sheet of paper now for some brainstorming. If you choose, you can pause this slideshow and work through each of these boxes. The first one is intended to help you localize your job search by thinking about your career goals and qualifications. The second box will help you build up the bullet point content to fill your resume. Those categories aren't exhaustive, but they're the ones that might apply to most of your experiences as a first or second year university student. They correspond loosely to the parts of a resume section on pages 144 to 146 of our textbook. And the third box follows up on some specialized qualities you might highlight on your resume if they fit with the position for which you're applying. We'll move on to the next slide, but you might benefit by working through these free writing topics now or later once you've finished watching this full slideshow. The free writing is meant to help you get words on the page so that you can then begin shaping the content of your resume. Before we look at these sample resumes, let's quickly peek at what another textbook defines as the 5 principles of design. Those are balance, alignment, grouping, consistency, and contrast. Unified documents will employ these principles so that readers can navigate them with a minimum of confusion. They provide access points, as the text says. The text also notes that readers are raters for information, plucking out the bits that are most relevant to their needs. That's to say, some documents we don't read from the top left corner to the bottom right. Our eyes move across the page like swallows under a bridge. And especially with resumes, readers skim. Our book says on page 143 that employers initially spend only 15 to 45 seconds looking at a resume. It can be disheartening to think that your reader fails to appreciate the care and effort you've put into your document, but that's how it is. If we accept that, we can design our documents so that they're more accessible and engaging. More than anything, we want to create documents that are usable, meaning our readers can make sense of them, and substantial, meaning they hold up to closer scrutiny. I use the word usable there. What is usability? We'll employ that term quite a lot in our discussions of workplace and technical writing. On page 41, our textbook says a document's usability is a measure of how well that document fulfills the information needs of its audience. It goes on to state that for a document to be usable, a reader must 1. Locate the information they need easily, 2. Understand the information immediately, and 3. Use the information safely and successfully. So usability, in short, refers to a document's ability to be used and understood. A usable website means you can find links, you aren't confused by the layout or formatting, and you aren't distracted by elements that are irrelevant to your needs. An unusable website might have dead links, inaccurate expressions, and advertisements that interrupt your experience. We can apply the concept of usability to most every mode of written communication, from emails to instructions to long reports. People make careers out of usability testing. When I taught at the University of Minnesota, we had an actual usability lab where computers were set up with eye tracking hardware so engineers could see how users scanned documents and web pages. If you ever acquire a video game or software in beta, you're basically usability testing it as the developers work out the kinks. Likewise, our peer review forums in the class are sort of like usability tests. Your classmates are viewing your documents to help you determine how to make them more efficient and effective. All that said, let's move on to our assessment of this week's sample resumes. I wish we were in a classroom together so we could discuss these resumes as a group. Because of the nature of the slideshow, however, you're only hearing my reactions to these documents. But my opinions are not the final word, and you might respond differently. Resumes are sort of like art in that they're assessed subjectively. We don't need a specialized vocabulary to discuss them, although we should move past our basic gut instincts and identify why or why not they appeal to us. As it happens, there's not much to debate about these first two documents. They're rather basic in their design. We're looking at them in thumbnail view as if we're holding them at arm's length. Although we can read them if we squint, our objective here is to assess the structure and design. The Michael J. Meyer resume is what our book calls a functional resume, meaning its sections are organized by skills. We see the overview and qualifications highlights sections, and they're operating in general time to explain how this applicant is suited for a job as an automotive technician. By contrast, the John J. Job Seeker resume is what our book calls a reverse chronological resume, meaning it gives more attention to the order of the applicant's employment and education. Neither approach is better than the other, it just depends how you want to organize your experiences. The reverse chronological approach, like with the John J. Job Seeker resume and the example on page 145 of our textbook, is probably more standard. That means the bulk of the document goes to sections for work experience and education, which are listed with the most recent entries first. Now, as for design, a few quick thoughts about the Michael J. Meyer document. It's nicely balanced. For example, the applicant uses 2 columns of bullet points up top in the overview section. If he had listed those 8 bullet points in a single column, it would take up a lot of vertical space and leave a big gap on the right side of the page. Another thing, he uses bullet points well. Bullet points, of course, demonstrate that certain information is given equal weight within a list, and they help a reader skim the document. Next, he emphasizes the most important information with bold and all caps font. Still, the sections do tend to run together a little bit, as if the headings aren't quite prominent enough. For example, the education heading seems lost at the bottom of the page because there's so much bolded and center-aligned text there. One final thing, I'd probably remove that black line border around the page, which doesn't accomplish much. Without that, we could decrease our margins and perhaps bump up the white space or the font sizes. For the John Jay Job Seeker resume, first I would note that your objectives section is always optional. You don't need to include that. In fact, I sometimes think those can come off as a little cheesy, where applicants are using big adjectives and trying to make themselves seem extra motivated or extra qualified. So the objective section is optional. As for structure, the Job Seeker resume gives most of its page to the professional experience section. Almost 3/4 of the document are used to describe his work at ABC Company and Specialty Company, Inc. He lists a lot of his job duties, which is useful to demonstrate that he's accomplished industry-specific job tasks, but it can also get redundant. If you're going to list your job duties, I'd suggest keeping it to the main 3 or 4. As for design, the sections of the resume are nicely partitioned with those maroon lines. They make it easy to skim the document and divide it into its 3 sections. We could say plenty more about these 2 documents, but now let's view a couple that are slightly more complex. Here we see 2 resumes that pack the page a bit more tightly. For our assignment in writing in the professions, you're creating a 1-page resume, so you need to fit everything onto just 1 page. You might have 5 pages of things to say about yourself, but a job review committee probably doesn't have the time or patience to read those 5 pages. As such, our resumes are like billboards, presenting only the information that can be glimpsed or skimmed. To fit things onto 1 page, you need to be selective. If you don't have room to list all your job duties, that's okay, because your readers might assume them anyway, or you might discuss them later during an interview. Fitting your resume onto a single page is a good challenge in document design. It forces you to employ those design principles from earlier in the slideshow, and it's a good opportunity to illustrate your organization and professionalism. With the Granger-Fisher resume, I would first point out that it feels too tightly packed. There's almost no white space between the sections and bullet point entries. Our book defines white space on page 129. It's how we group certain elements visually and how we provide a visual pause. Most printed documents use white space to separate text and images or to subtly delineate between page elements. Because there's no white space on the Granger-Fisher resume, the applicant probably felt compelled to insert those thick black lines between sections, which only make it feel more cramped. But I can see a different solution. Look how many of the bullet point entries have just 1 word spilling onto a second line. We could strategically edit those entries so they fit onto just 1 line. For instance, see where it says, mentor and train junior engineers on design of piping systems and sedimentation control processes. Well, mentor and train mean about the same thing. If we delete and train, the line would say, mentor junior engineers on design of piping systems, etc. Then that text would fit onto just 1 line. Similarly, we could creatively edit all 4 of the bullet point lines under that civil engineer, public works department section, and then we'd free up some vertical space. The next step would be to distribute that space evenly and create a more balanced page design. The Noah Posner resume is likewise a bit cramped. This applicant uses a table layout with alternating gray and white backgrounds. Nothing wrong with that, although I haven't seen too many other resumes that use this approach. It's probably a result of however the applicant set up his page using Microsoft Word or maybe Excel or who knows what program. You'll notice that right now the margins are so tight that the text probably runs beyond the printable spaces of the page. I see some places we could rearrange the text to give ourselves more room to work with. For instance, to alleviate some of the vertical pressure, we could create a 2-column layout for the entries under the knowledge and skills heading, which would save us 3 or 4 lines. And it depends what job Noah Posner might be applying for, but perhaps his summer work with the Missoula Children's Theater Camp might not be relevant. If that's the case, say he's applying for an engineering job, I'd probably suggest not even mentioning it on the 1-page resume. I used to work at McDonald's and Domino's Pizza, but I don't mention that now when I'm applying for teaching jobs. When we include irrelevant information, it detracts from the relevant stuff. That said, I find the Noah Posner resume pretty clean and easy to skim, although we could experiment with a more traditional layout as well. On this next slide, we see two versions of the same information. All of the text is the same between the resumes on the left and right. Obviously, though, the resume on the right is more visually attractive. It takes a few design risks and it shows ambition. Is the resume on the right better? Well, yes, it is better, although our answer to that question depends a little on how we define better. The goal of a cover letter and resume is to get you to the next stage of the application process, the job interview. Imagine that the review committee gets 60 applications for one job. They don't have time to read each cover letter and resume in full. They're looking for those that create favorable impressions. Again, the words don't change from the resume on the left to the resume on the right. Accordingly, the man applying for the job, Ankur Patel, doesn't change either. Yet because his qualifications seem more memorable in the second resume, he seems like a more memorable job candidate. For that reason, the more highly designed document achieves its purpose more effectively. That resume on the left, it's not terrible. It gets the job done with no frills. Some readers might actually prefer it because it seems less flashy. But when we view it in this small scale version, the text does seem to run together. The section headings aren't very prominent. There's some unused white space to the right of that areas of expertise section. It communicates the essential information about Ankur Patel, but it appears to be a document that was typed into Microsoft Word in a single afternoon. If I was grading the resume on the left, I'd give it a solid C. It's clean and comprehensible, but it's dull. The resume on the right, it creates a brand. As readers, we make assumptions about how Ankur Patel conducts himself professionally. He's innovative, polished, and professional. Confident, but also restrained. Most likely, the applicant used Adobe InDesign, not Google Docs or Microsoft Word for this resume. It follows a two-column layout. The left column is somewhat narrow and it contains the sections About, Education, and Contact. The right column is wider and more substantial, and it has sections for skills and area of expertise and work experience. You can imagine that the layout came together sort of like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, requiring some creativity along the way. And although the resume doesn't follow a traditional format, readers could navigate it rather easily since the section headings are so prominent. I believe it's useful looking at these two resumes to see how working through drafts can help us develop our ideas further and advertise ourselves better as job candidates. These resumes also demonstrate that how we say things can be just as important as what we say. And that leads to our final two sample resumes, which push things even further with design. Like with the second Ankur Patel resume, these two probably weren't created using Google Docs or Microsoft Word. They have lots of flourishes, and sometimes I'm afraid those flourishes distract from the most important thing, the words themselves. In past semesters, students have generally reacted with disgust to these two documents, but I could see an argument for their effectiveness. The main issue with the Molly Horn resume is that it wastes too much space. Those wavy gold lines are decorative, but they aren't functional. Imagine they aren't there. The top margin is probably 2 or 3 inches tall, and the applicant could use that space for a better purpose. She effectively shrunk her page, and as a result, she has less room to show her job qualifications. Next, the colors on the page seem to work against the purpose of guiding the reader. The light gold headings, for instance, education and achievements, get lost since they don't contrast against the white background. Similarly, the gray typeface feels a bit too easy to ignore. It's a daring design. It stands out against most of the resumes we've already seen, but it seems flashy without much substance. That said, this resume is still clean and fairly attractive. Next, it's easy to have a knee-jerk reaction against the Dylan Pulley resume because it's so colorful and loud. But I can accept that as a risk, especially when you consider that he's working in the field of graphic design. By creating his resume like this, he's demonstrating his aesthetics and his style. You might not like that style, but the resume shows rather than tells. Further, you see by the date that this document was prepared back in 2010, and our aesthetic preferences might have been a little different back then. Just the same, my complaint about this document is that, like the Molly Horn resume, the design elements take up so much space. The more traditional resume sections, notably experience and education, are reduced to just part of the right column. In turn, this resume also feels like a lot of flash and noise, little substance. But it catches the reader's attention and it shows that this applicant is bold. So which of these resumes is the best? There's really no saying. If you're applying for a marketing position, you probably won't want a plain resume like the first Ankur Patel one. But if you're applying for a lab scientist position, you might not want a boisterous resume like the Dylan Pulley one. In this way, we can think of your resume design almost like the outfit you would wear to your job interview. Is it traditional? Is it subversive? Is it merely a cover so that you don't offend your audience's sensibilities? Most importantly, we want our resumes to be clean and orderly so that they represent us well professionally. They should make a strong first impression and they should compel readers to look more closely. At this stage of your careers, you might adopt a more traditional resume design. For now, it's most important that you get all your necessary details onto the page. As you gain more experience here at the university, your resume will evolve. You'll drop out the less relevant aspects, like high school stuff, in favor of more recent activities, honors, and experiences. By choosing a more traditional design now, you might have an easier time updating the document as you progress through college. I discourage you from using a template for your resume. For one thing, someone else might use the exact same template, which will make you look unoriginal. But also, templates come pre-programmed with lots of odd, inflexible little quirks. In other words, they're easy to mess up. So you'll gain more practice and have more control over your page design if you learn to work with the rules and limitations of Microsoft Word. We have several slides remaining, but I'm not going to linger on these ones quite as long. This slide and the next one provide both cover letters and resumes. These documents are taken with permission from previous professional writing students. I'll point out just a few things to which I would respond when grading these documents. First, the cover letter begins with a useful statement that names the job for which the applicant is applying and where she learned about it. Next, the paragraphs all appear concise and manageable with topic sentences to preview the information within each paragraph. I might suggest that the writer read her letter out loud, and she might catch some wordiness and redundancy. For instance, some sentences have a roundabout logic to them, and the words skill and skilled are overused. And in some cases, it just repeats details that will appear in the resume. But overall, the cover letter is clean, it's not too long, and it concludes by introducing the resume and suggesting an interview. The resume itself is kind of okay. I'd note that graphically all the lines are so short that all the ink appears on the left side of the page. Is that a problem? Not really. I'd rather have a writer who keeps things concise and doesn't add in extra words only to produce clutter. But the page does seem imbalanced, and I wonder if we could experiment with columns or different alignments. This resume seems rather basic. It's easy to navigate, but like with one of our previous resumes, it seems like it was typed up in an hour without much thought to design. And I should note that I'm actually more nitpicky than I'm letting on in this slideshow. For instance, look at the inconsistent length and spacing of dashes and hyphens between dates on the resume. We need to standardize those because an astute reader will infer about your attention to detail from how you format your resume. And here's one more cover letter resume combo. I find this cover letter more effective than the previous one because it tells more of a story about the applicant's experiences. By contrast, the previous letter just listed skills. For that reason, this one feels more like a communication, like the writer is aware of her audience. She's writing to them. Her tone is more assertive and more commanding. The paragraphs feel balanced and more developed. The formatting is consistent with modified block style, although that's not too terribly important. As a quick side note, we'll talk about modified block style and letter formatting in next week's lecture. It's a good clean letter, and I wanted to read the entire thing rather than just skim it, which is a high compliment. As for the resume, we might find some ways to improve it. Although I appreciate how prominent those blue headings are, they seem loud and stylistically out of place. Further, when you type something in all caps, Microsoft Word might not recognize misspellings. The word extracurricular should have 2 R's in it. Small typo, but it indicates carelessness. Next, the line spacing is inconsistent. See how the line marketing major 3.15 GPA is actually closer to the next line about the applicant's high school education? A reader will see things closely grouped and think they're related. It's a problem throughout this document where there's too much space after a primary entry and not enough space between unrelated items. Next, the applicant uses too much bold and all caps. Those methods of textual emphasis are best used sparingly. If you emphasize everything, nothing is emphasized. This resume is a good first draft, but we could clear up some basic formatting things. Chapter 8 of our textbook, Designing User-Friendly Documents, introduces the concepts of visual consistency and cohesiveness, which will be valuable to your work with your own resume. Very briefly, I'll remind you that you can craft your cover letter and resume to a company for which you'd like to work, regardless of whether they have a posted job opening. We would call that a cold or unsolicited cover letter. The company might respond or they might not, but your letter will show initiative, and odds are they'll file it away, and if they remember you, they'll remember you kindly. Don't worry about the formatting of this letter, which looks weird to my eye. I reproduce this just so we can imagine a different context for contacting a company with a cover letter and resume. This letter and the ones on the next 2 slides are from a book called Cover Letters That Knock 'Em Dead by Martin Yale. Here is an example of a job seeker calling on a professional contact to inquire about a job. I reproduce this because we should consider how lots of jobs today are located through networking. Networking is just another word for professional friendships. You might make connections within your industry, and those connections could lead to referrals and jobs. You can attend conferences and symposiums, join online communities, volunteer and participate at places you'd eventually like to work. That will lead to a deeper investment in your field, and it will also make you more aware of new opportunities. Finally, internships can often lead to full-time employment. An internship is when you work for a place as a junior employee, often with the purpose of learning more about the job and the job field. Internships allow you to see how your classroom knowledge is applied in the workplace. You might get a mentor who coaches you up and answers the questions you have as a young professional. Unfortunately, most internships are unpaid or paid poorly, but you should consider seeking one toward the end of your time here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And not all internships are advertised, many are simply arranged. Like with the cover letter we looked at a couple slides back, you can contact a place cold to inquire about interning with them. The university wants you to succeed once you graduate, and the Office of Career Services provides some excellent resources for your job search. Their website offers tutorials and sample documents, and you can schedule one-on-one sessions with their career counselors to draft and edit your cover letter and resume. You're free to use their resources for your work on this assignment, and I encourage you to check in with them again when you're nearing graduation. And that does it for this slideshow on sample resumes. Next week, we'll discuss formatting for short correspondence, letters, memos, and emails. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back here next week.